In this video, we're going to continue the conversation about Jeff Lynne and the Electric Light Orchestra and discuss a few ways that John, Paul, George, and Ringo influenced Jeff. Hello, I'm Lance, and here on the FabFourArchivist channel, we dig deep into the music, people, and everything else surrounding the Beatles. In 2002, Rolling Stone made a list of 50 uncool albums, and ELO's A New World Record made the list. The magazine slammed Jeff Lynne, calling his interest in the Beatles a fixation. For what it's worth, I think the script has been flipped. If you own this album, you're officially cool nowadays. While this wasn't a polite dig from Rolling Stone, the Beatles' influence was clearly there from the very beginning. In 1970, Jeff Lynne left the Idol race and eventually formed the Electric Light Orchestra with Roy Wood and Bev Bevan. And if you start looking into ELO's early days, I guarantee you'll hear something like this quote. The band's aim was to pick up where the Beatles left off, or more specifically, pick up where the Beatles left off with I'm the Walrus. Music journalist Ken Sharp asked Jeff Lynne about this a few years ago. That was never really my thing. Actually, Roy Wood said that, not me, and he left the group 2 months after and lumbered me with that kind of quote. Oh really? Thanks a lot, buddy. But overall, what this quote implies is pretty accurate. And when linked to the first single by ELO, you can't help but subconsciously hear I'm the Walrus. The responsibility for this, or the blame, depending on how you see things, lies with both Jeff Lynne and Roy Wood. Lynne may playfully put it on Wood, but it's not like Lynne didn't continue the Beatles vibe. As I mentioned in my first ELO video, John Lennon discussed the group while playing disc jockey in 1974. During this appearance, Lennon even referenced this quote.
But I remember the statement they made when they first formed was to carry on from where the Beatles left off with Walrus, and they certainly did.
Paul McCartney noted the heavy Beatles influence too.
You know, when I heard ELO, it was very what we'd been doing on Sgt. Pepper. And so I think the first thing was, I know where he got that from. But then you can't resist it. It's just so good.
Jeff Lynne isn't ashamed to admit the inspiration. He admires the band and worked closely with them. But he's also quick to point out that there's more there than Beatles inspiration in his own recordings. In 2001, in Guitar Player magazine, he said, I don't think it's really a Beatle thing. I mean, it is, but that's not the be-all and end-all of it. I just strive to get nice chord changes that give you a nice, pleasurable feeling. And in 2015, speaking with The Sun, he took a firmer stance, denying ELO copied the Beatles. Roy and I always used to talk about having this group with strings in it. For 10538 Overture, Roy got this cello and he learned to play the bloody thing in a week. It sounded fantastic, but it was the only song that ever sounded like the Beatles. But everybody said, copying the Beatles, copying the Beatles. It was bull. Now, not to pick nits with Mr. Lynne, but there are other songs that, quote, sound like the Beatles in the ELO catalog. For instance, listen to this by co-founder Roy Wood, also on the band's first album.
Look at me now, feeling emotion. Look at all the lovely people.
For that matter, Mr. Blue Sky, arguably ELO's best-known song, has a ton in common with the bridge section from A Day in the Life. One of my favorite creators on YouTube, Polyphonic, recently released a beautiful video that explored this.
Both open on similar piano parts and both narrate the start of a day. In case that's not enough, ELO even used a vocal sample of someone panting in homage to the Beatles' sound design.
There are other examples that we could get into, but in fairness to Lynne, there are more subtle influences from the Beatles and beyond, ones that go deeper than just adding horns and cellos to a rock song. Sticking with the Beatles, one effect they had on Lynne was their use of the studio as an instrument. Yeah, they brought in big string sections, but they also used feedback and tape loops and the synthesizer and so on. There were other artists doing this, but no one brought it to the masses the way the Fab Four did. When Lynne, and to a certain extent Wood, combined this with tech advances and their own pop sensibilities, we ended up with brand new sounds, and often in a live format. It was the Beatles' spirit of experimentation that influenced ELO. One musical trick sometimes linked to Lynne is the descending or lament bass line. It was used in ELO songs, and even in Into the Great Wide Open, which Jeff co-wrote with Tom Petty. And the Beatles did use this, in I'm the Walrus for one, but also in Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and in the middle section of George Harrison's Something. But calling this copying is incorrect. It's just a musical form, similar to Pachelbel's canon. I didn't analyze the numbers, but I'd say Led Zeppelin used this more often than Jeff Lynne. Besides the Beatles, two of Jeff Lynne's heroes are Shannon and Roy Orbison. Funny enough, two musicians the Beatles played alongside in the early 60s. Chuck Berry is also on that list of heroes. These three were among the first true craftsmen of pop and rock. They were singer-songwriters when there weren't many artists writing their own tunes. If cover songs are any indication of influence, ELO recorded Shannon's Little Town Flirt in 1979, and more obviously, Chuck Berry's Roll Over Beethoven. Lynne worked with Orbison, of course, as a wheelbarrow and a producer, and also with Shannon producing his final album. One influence we know didn't come from the Beatles? Disco. Thank God. Back to Lennon's stint as a DJ when he played Showdown. Besides the Beatles, he noticed someone else.
This is a beautiful combination of I Heard It Through the Grapevine by Marvin Gaye and Lightning Strikes Again, Lou Christie. And it's a beautiful job with a little walrus underneath.
As a bookend to this video, I'm putting together a quick clip that points out these three influences in Showdown. I'll post that exclusively on the FabFourArchivist page on Facebook, so give it a like over there and be on the lookout for it. Lynne's work is not quote-unquote copying the Beatles, or anyone else for that matter. It is Electric Light Orchestra making some of the classic hallmarks from other artists their very own. The influences are there, but more than a nostalgic wink, the transformation masterfully makes the ELO songs feel instantly familiar. And for some of the better ones, you can't get them out of your head. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more videos on the Beatles.